You probably think you know the story of Noah's Ark. A good guy, a huge flood, two of every animal on a big boat. It's a story of survival, of a fresh start. But honestly, that's just the kids' version. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the much darker, way more complicated parts of Noah's story. A story that, believe it or not, was twisted to create a map of our world, and even to justify centuries of unimaginable cruelty.
So here's the journey we're going to take. First, we'll ask, could the flood have actually happened? Then, we're getting into the really strange and pretty disturbing stuff that went down after the Ark landed. We'll see how a bizarre family drama spiraled into a legacy of pure hate. We'll also look at how Noah's sons were seen as a kind of blueprint for all of humanity. And we'll even explore what Noah himself might have believed. And finally, we're going to see how this ancient story echoes in a truly tragic way in our world today.
All right, first things first, was the flood a real event? Now, a flood that covers the entire planet, scientifically, that doesn't really hold up. But a lot of geologists think this global myth might actually have its roots in a very real and unbelievably catastrophic local event.
Okay, so a couple of geologists, William Ryan and Walter Pittman, they put forward this really fascinating idea. For thousands and thousands of years, the Black Sea wasn't a sea at all. It was a giant freshwater lake, totally cut off from the Mediterranean. But then, around 7,500 years ago, everything changed. The Ice Age glaciers had melted, the Mediterranean was swelling with all that water, and it just broke through that little strip of land we call the Bosporus.
Now, the sheer scale of this is almost impossible to wrap your head around. We're talking about a waterfall with 200 times the force of Niagara Falls, just roaring, non-stop for months. The new sea would have swallowed up farmland at a rate of a mile every single day. If you were living there, this wasn't just a flood, it was the end of the world. It's the kind of trauma that gets passed down for generations, the kind of thing that could absolutely become the seed for all those flood myths we see in cultures all over the globe.
But you know what? The flood itself, that's just the opening act. The real human drama, the part with the lasting and frankly destructive power, that all happens next.
So what happens after this grand rescue of humanity is so important. The book of Genesis says Noah plants a vineyard, makes some wine, gets completely hammered, and passes out naked in his tent. It's a weirdly, almost disappointingly human moment for the guy who just saved the world, right?
And this is where we get to the absolute core of the mystery. The text says Noah's son, Ham, saw the nakedness of his father and then went and told his brothers about it. And Noah's reaction? He lays down this absolutely terrible curse. But what did Ham do? What does that even mean? For thousands of years, this has been the question.
And the theories are all over the place, from pretty simple to really extreme. Was it just voyeurism? Did Ham just peek in and then go make fun of his dad? Or was it something way worse? Some ancient writers actually argued that Ham castrated Noah. Others said that seeing nakedness was a biblical code phrase for a sexual act, maybe with Noah himself, or, as some modern scholars have theorized, with Noah's wife, his own mother. This ambiguity, this big question mark in the story, it created a vacuum that, as we'll see, got filled with some truly devastating ideas.
So you have this really vague, confusing story, and this is where things take a truly dark turn. This is where a family squabble gets weaponized, becoming a tool of oppression used for centuries to justify some of the worst cruelty imaginable.
Okay, and here's a crucial detail that almost everyone misses. Noah doesn't actually curse Ham. He skips a generation. He curses his grandson, Canaan, saying he'll be a servant of servants. Now, originally, this was probably just political. It was a way to create a divine justification for the ancient Israelites to go and conquer the people living in the land of Canaan. But the story did not stop there.
I mean, just look at how this one idea evolved, how it mutated into something truly monstrous. The Bible never ever says anything about skin color in this story, but by the 7th century, some writers started connecting the curse to blackness and servitude. By the Renaissance, it was a full-blown theory used to create racial hierarchies. And then in the 18th and 19th centuries, the curse of Ham became one of the main biblical excuses for the transatlantic slave trade. It was a way to say that God himself sanctioned the brutal system of chattel slavery. This twisted idea even got written into Mormon scripture in the 1800s.
Years later, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. confronted this toxic idea head-on, and he called it exactly what it is, a blasphemy. A total perversion of faith, something that is against everything that the Christian religion stands for.
So that's one path this story took, right? A really destructive one. But believe it or not, that's not the only way Noah's family was used to explain the world. There's another part of Genesis that presents a totally different idea, one that's less about a curse and a lot more like a map of all of humanity.
Yeah, in Genesis chapter 10, you find this thing called the Table of Nations. You can think of it like an ancient attempt at anthropology. It's the authors genuinely trying to make sense of the world's incredible diversity by tracing every single person's family tree all the way back to Noah's 3 sons. So in this tradition, Shem is the ancestor of the peoples in Asia, Ham is the father of the peoples in Africa, and Japheth is the ancestor of the peoples in Europe. It's this remarkable ancient blueprint for the entire human family.
Which of course brings up a really interesting theological question. Noah comes way before Abraham, so he lived long before Judaism, Christianity, or Islam ever existed. So, what exactly was his religion? What did Noah believe?
Well, both Jewish and Islamic traditions see Noah as this incredibly important, righteous guy who believed in one God, but they frame his faith a little differently. In Islam, he's known as Nuh, a major prophet who preached pure monotheism, or Tawhid. In Judaism, his faith is seen through this idea of Noahidism, the belief that he followed a set of universal moral laws that were meant for all of humanity, not just for one group of people.
These 7 laws of Noah are seen as this kind of basic moral code for everyone. It's like a universal operating system for how to build a just and decent society. Things like don't murder, don't steal, set up courts of justice. It's a framework for being a good person that comes before any one specific religion.
We've seen Noah's story as a map of the world and a moral code. But when you strip everything else away, at its heart, it's also a story about a family dealing with trauma, a story about a patriarch's failure and its devastating fallout. And that theme, the failure of a protector, has a painful and tragic echo in our own times.
Because in 2019, the story of a little boy, also named Noah, became this horrifying example of what happens when the very systems designed to protect us fail completely.
$20 million. That's the number. That was the settlement Los Angeles County paid out. But the number isn't the real story. The real story is that social workers had a court order in their hands to remove 4-year-old Noah Quattro from his parents' home. They never did it. And less than 2 months later, his parents tortured him to death.
His great-grandmother's words, they just bring the horror of it all into sharp focus. She said, "He always begged me not to send him to his parents. He'd take his little hands and look into my eyes and say, 'Don't make me go there.' It's just a devastating plea from a child that went completely unheard by the people who had the power to save him."
And so that leaves us here with this question. The name Noah is supposed to mean rest or comfort, but that name carries such an immense, tragic weight. From the ancient patriarch whose family drama was twisted into a justification for slavery, to the little boy who was failed by the very people supposed to give him comfort. It really forces you to ask, how do the echoes of these ancient stories of righteousness and sin and terrible failure, how did they still shape the tragedies of our world today?